Good morning. Welcome to Ms. Abiodun's demo class. Okay, so my name is Ms. Abiodun, but my students normally call me Ms. Abby. So for today's class, we'll be looking at Introduction to Peter. We call it Peter paragraph. So Peter is an acronym for some words. In the course of the lesson, we get to know the full meaning of Peter. But before we go into the lesson properly, I would like us to quickly attempt this starter. So the starter is on figures of speech. Let's try to harvest your knowledge on figures of speech. Okay, so you read the sentences and pick the correct figure of speech for each of the sentence. Okay, the beginning of the end of all things. So what do you think that is? Is it a metaphor? Is it an oxymoron, allusion, or assonance? Well, pick your answer while I'm waiting. All right. So let's quickly look at the second one. His blood ran cold in his veins. So what are we talking about? Is it imagery? Is it medium, a connotation, or assonance? Yeah, I'm waiting. Okay. All right. Oh God, what am I to do? So what figure of speech is that? Could you quickly pick your answer? We're just going to attempt less than 10 questions that will move on into the lesson in proper. Okay. Good job so far. You're doing great. The fox still slept on the wing above the drowned city. The fog still slept on the wing above the drowned city. So, is it possible for a fog to sleep? So, what figure of speech gives the attribute of a living thing to a non-living thing? So, pick your answer, and that would probably be the last question for today. So let's quickly go back into the lesson and proper. Like I said, we're looking at introduction to Peter paragraph. So I'll quickly acquaint you with the meaning of Peter. Peter means point, evidence, technique, explain, and reader. Point, evidence, technique, explain, and reader. So what is the objective for today? The objective is for you to know how to use Peter paragraph to answer your why and your how questions. Okay? You'll be given some questions like how did something happen like that, or why did something. So we call them the why and the how questions. So you can make use of Peter paragraph to respond to these questions. And this is a structure for your response. The first one is point, the second one is evidence, the third one is technique, fourth is explain, and R is reading. So what do we mean by points? You go straight to the point, you answer the question as direct as possible. Okay? The evidence is when you got your question, the answer form, you're going to have to pick an evidence to support the answer you gave on the points. Then you pick the technique. So this particular answer, what technique is used? It could be literary technique, like we talked about, figures of speech. So you could look for the figures of speech if it is a figure of speech. So this is one of the techniques. Of course, the techniques talks about the literary devices or the linguistic devices. Then you need to explain it. You explain it in such a way, you explain the technique and connect it to your answer on the points. And the last one is you write about the effects on the reader. You are a reader. So your answer, how does it affect you? Yes. So write about the effects that this has on the modern reader, on a reader from the time it was written. So you put yourself as the reader, okay? And you talk about the effect on you as a reader or any other person as a reader. But before we go deep into the class, I would like to quickly show you a video on Peter paragraph. that will continue from there.
78 organs and 206 bones?
Interesting and winning paragraph, and one of these methods is using the Peter paragraph. Now, Peter is an acronym for the following: point, evidence, technique, explanation, and reader. Again, this acronym might sound like really complicated, it might sound very confusing, but actually, to be honest, the Peter paragraph is one of a range of paragraphs that you can use that can be very effective in achieving your aims of making your explanations really clear. And also, this is also a good way of organizing your thoughts as you're writing out your responses, be it for a language test or for a literature test. Now, as you can see behind me, I have put together an example Peter paragraph, which I want to walk you through. Now, remember that this example is just taken from a language exercise, okay? However, you can substitute some of these keywords for example, if you're given a Macbeth essay, you can substitute those keywords for Macbeth, or if you're given an essay on whatever other text, you can substitute it for that, and indeed any other language extract, okay? But this is just one of the examples, and this is taken from an exam extract, okay? More specifically by a lady called Susan Hill, okay? This appeared in a language paper. Now, let's quickly look at the question in my example before I show you how I applied the Peter method to answering this question and crafting my paragraph. Now, the question was, how does the opening of this extract create a tense atmosphere? Now, you will notice within this question, I've already underlined some words. These are what we call keywords, the most important bits of the question that you need to directly address in your answer to show your teacher or your examiner that you understand the assignment. The keywords are opening, tense, as well as atmosphere, okay? These are the stuff that's not so obvious within the question that you need to directly address. Now, as I mentioned, Peter stands for point, evidence, technique, explanation, and reader. So let's start off with point. What does that mean? Point simply means you're answering the question directly and you're referring in your opening by directly referring to the keywords. These are the bits that you underlined from the question. So let's read through my example. Now, this is my opening point. The opening of this extract creates a tense, ominous atmosphere. Ominous means terrifying, scary. As we can see, the narrator feels secluded and alienated, secluded, alone, and alienated. Ilmarsh House seems isolated, hence there's a powerful feeling of dread created. Now, in my opening point, I have restated the key words, the words opening, tense, and atmosphere here, okay? So I've talked about the opening of this extract, a tense atmosphere. The reason why I have restated these words is because I'm showing the examiner really clearly, hey, I understand this question, and I'm going to begin by addressing this question directly. You have to do that in your opening point, okay? So that's the P in my Peter paragraph. Now let's look at the E in my Peter paragraph, which is evidence. Evidence simply means quote from the text to support your opening point. Now let's look at my quotation. We learned that, speech marks, the house felt like a ship at sea, close speech marks in the extract, okay? So as you can see here, I have embedded my quotation, which is the house felt like a ship at sea, okay? So I've embedded this quotation within my evidence, okay? Again, as I mentioned, evidence is you supporting your opening point. Now let's look at the T in my Peter paragraph. T, as I mentioned, stands for technique, and what this means is you need to mention a technical term. Does the writer use a really interesting form of alliteration, simile, metaphor, even sentence type, okay? Do they use an interesting simple sentence, compound, complex, declarative, and so on, okay? So now let's look at how I've talked about technique here. The author's use of the simile, speech marks, like a ship, close speech marks, emphasizes how turbulent and tumultuous, turbulent means violent, tumultuous means unpredictable, okay? The weather was outside, okay? So the author's use of the simile, like a ship, emphasizes how turbulent and tumultuous the weather was outside. As you can see here, I have mentioned very clearly a technique, which is simile. Now let's move on to the E in my Peter. So this is the second E, which is explanation. Explanation simply means you need to explain the effect of this technique. I will show you what I mean by explaining the effect of this technique. This conveys the narrator's feeling of dread and terror, okay? So as you can see here, the effect that I'm showing is what does this show us about the character in this story, okay? It seems they are alone in a vast house which seems unstable, thus they feel vulnerable. Now I've explained how this simile also is showing that the narrator is like totally alone, okay? There's nobody around them, all right? So I've said that the narrator feels dread and terror. That's the first explanation, but also I then expand on that by saying also the way the house is described, it seems really unstable, so the narrator feels totally exposed, totally vulnerable. That is my explanation. I'm now explaining this technique a bit further. However, I'm not yet done with my Peter paragraph because I have to talk about the R bit, the reader, how this affects us as readers. Of course, if it's a play you're talking about, you need to talk about audience, okay? So as I mentioned, in the reader bit, you have to explain how this makes us as readers feel and link it back to the question. The key words in the question, of course, being opening, tense, and atmosphere, okay? So I'm going to read my reader part now. Thus, we as readers develop a terrible feeling of foreboding. Foreboding means like a really bad feeling that something terrible is going to happen, as we wonder if the narrator will be attacked. Hence, the author creates a tense atmosphere at the opening, which immediately captivates us, okay? So as you can see here, I've mentioned tense atmosphere, as well as this idea of it being at the opening. I've restated the keywords.
So that is a video on Peter paragraph for you. So we're going to use our own example to explain Peter paragraph. How you can use Peter paragraph to craft an answer to to how and why questions. So let's look at this question first. Okay, so I have read the excerpt from Anthem for Doomed Youth and answer the question that follows. So Anthem for Doomed Youth is actually a poem by Owen, okay? And this is a part of the poem. So what passing bells for those who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifle rapid rattle can patter out their hasty horizons. No mockeries for them now, no prayers, no bells, no any voice of mourning save the quiets, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, the bugle calling for them from sad shines. Okay, so now let's look at this question. This is a typical example of how question. So how does a poet use language to describe the theme of the death of conflict? So first thing first, we need to underline the key words, okay? So the key words here, we're looking at describe, of course, the use of language to describe. Then we're looking at the theme of death in conflict. So first thing first, we need to answer the question. So let's take a look at my own answer. Okay. If I want to answer this, I can start like this. Don't forget the keywords are very important. So I can say the poet uses language to describe the theme of death in conflicts. Or we can go by saying the poet describes the theme of death in conflict. Okay, how does it describe it? As destructive and wasteful. So that is my point. So the poet describes the theme of death in conflict as destructive and wasteful. So this would be my point, P-O-I-N-T. Don't forget we're using Peter paragraph. And when you're making use of Peter paragraph, the first one is to answer the question directly. Okay, so I've answered the question directly. Now let's go to evidence. Okay, what point in the text shows that the poet describes the theme of death in conflict as destructive and wasteful. So we're going to look for the evidence, okay? So my evidence is going to be so I'm going to say it describes the death of course, this is a typical example of war crime. So I want to believe it's talking about soldiers. So it described the death of the soldiers at war by comparing them to, I'm going to put it in quotes, okay? By comparing them to the way cattle die. So I've actually brought out my evidence, okay? Now, but I need to state my evidence clearly. So I'm going to start with a rhetorical question, okay? So that's one of the techniques that we're going to be talking about because that evidence is actually a rhetorical question. So I'm going to start from the beginning. What person bows for these who die as cattle? All right. For these who die as cattle. I mean, you can have a picture of the death of an animal in your head. So that's like an imagery, okay? Think about it. Do you bury animals that die? For instance, if a cattle should die, do you bury them? No. You'll probably throw them away because it's a waste. So what the poet has simply done there is to make use of rhetorical question to emphasize that soldiers go to war or when there is a conflict and they die as animals. So nobody is going to mourn them properly. So that is, so talking about the evidence, let me quickly go to the technique. Okay, the technique could be more than one. So it depends on the one you would like to use. But in this case, I would want to use rhetorical question, okay? So I'm going to point out the language and connect it to my answer. So I'm using the literary technique of rhetorical question, okay? So we know the technique already because the technique has already been pointed out in the evidence. So I don't need to go back to that. So I'm just going to go straight to explaining it better. Okay, so using the literary technique of rhetorical question, okay? The poet emphasizes the meaningless, I can say meaninglessness of war and the consequences. Let me add what? Fatal consequences. Fatal consequences of war, okay? To compare the death of soldiers to that of an animal, which is usually wasteful. So I've actually connected my technique, I've connected my technique to my response. Okay, so I've connected my technique to my response. I don't know why that's not changing, but fine. So the next one we'll go to is to explain. I've actually done a bit of explanation under my technique, okay? But the next one is to explain, okay? So we're going to explain right now. So when you're explaining, you're going to write about why the author used this technique. I've actually talked about that on the technique. Maybe I should, because all these are actually intertwined, okay? As long as you use all the components, it's very important to use all the components. But maybe because I'm a teacher, so in the process of stating the technique, I already incorporated my explanation on the technique. So I'm going to try to separate them for you as a student, okay? So using the literary technique of rhetorical question, so, okay, let me say, the poet uses rhetorical question. So I'm just going to copy the rhetorical question one more time. Control C, Control V again. So, so the poet uses rhetorical question to explain how war breeds wastefulness. Okay, so I'm going to try to explain it now. Control X, okay. Control V, okay. So now I'm trying to do my explanation now. The poet emphasizes the meaninglessness of war and the fatal consequences of it, okay, by comparing. So there is a subtle comparison between the death of the soldiers and animals, okay, by comparing the death of soldiers to that of animals, okay, which is usually wasteful. So now we'll go to reader. So as a reader, what effects does he have on you as a reader? What effects does this have on you as a reader? Okay, so as a reader, I can draw the conclusion that war war is, I'm linking it back to my question, destructive and leads to wasteful. I'm using wasteful one more time. Wasteful loss of lives. Wasteful loss of lives. That could amount to something meaningful later in years. So, I mean, the effect on the reader could be perceived from different perspectives because you are the reader. As long as you connect the effect on the reader to the points that you've given from the beginning. So that is how to make use of your points, evidence, technique, explain, and reading. So when you bring this together, when you bring all this together, you realize you have a full paragraph. Of course, you have more than 5 sentences there. So let's try to read everything together to proofread for errors and mistakes. So the poet describes, okay, it's very important for you to proofread, okay, the theme of death in conflict as destructive and wasteful. There's something I forgot to do. So as a reader, I draw the conclusion that, okay, I want to restate my keywords. Death in conflict, because it's important, okay? It's destructive and leads to wasteful loss of lives and properties, okay? And properties, okay? So the poet describes the theme of death in conflict as destructive and wasteful. I went straight to answer the question. So how does the poet use language to describe the theme of death in conflict? So I went straight to answer the question. Then I picked my evidence. It describes the death of the soldiers at war by comparing them to animals. Okay. From what we can say there, what passing bells for those who die as cattle? Then the technique. This is a typical example of a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question is a question that does not demand an answer. It does not require an answer. So the poet uses rhetorical question, what passing bells for these who die as cattle, to explain how war breeds wastefulness. Then I'm trying to explain my technique as well. Okay, so the poet emphasizes, do not forget the rhetorical question is used to emphasize, okay? So the poet emphasizes the meaninglessness of war and the fatal consequences of it by comparing the death of soldiers to that of animals, which is usually wasteful, okay? Then I go ahead to talk about my feeling as a reader, okay? So what you feel as a reader should connect to your point, to your answer, okay? There should not be a disconnect. It must connect. You're going back to the response, talking about your point, okay? So as a reader, I can draw the conclusion that death in conflict is destructive, okay? We can decide to use another synonym, okay? And leads to wasteful loss of lives and properties that could amount to something meaningful in later years. So that is how to make use of your Peter to craft a response to why and how questions. Okay, so let's take a look at more examples of how and why questions. Okay, look at these are examples from exam questions. So we have look in details at line 16 to 22 of the source. The source is the text provided for you. How does the writer use language here to describe the shepherd and his animals? So there are prompts to follow as well. So you could include the writer's choice of words and phrases, language features and techniques, and sentence forms. Okay, so we have it in different ways and different manners, talking about the questions. But your answer must follow the Peter paragraph, talking about the points, the evidence, the technique, the explain, and the reader. So I'm going to go back to explain them one more time, okay, and give you an assignment, in that so that you can do. So points. So you write a simple one-sentence response to the exam question that gives your opinion on it. And that is exactly what I did with the question I answered. using evidence, okay? Use a direct quote from the book, the play, the poem, or the text, whatever you're given, as evidence that backs up your points. I did exactly that. If we take a look at it one more time, then the technique. You need to point out the language technique. Okay, the language technique I favored is actually a rhetorical question. Okay, we have other techniques there. We have onomatopoeia there. You can make use of onomatopoeia if you really want to use onomatopoeia, okay? And you can make use of metaphor because there is metaphor there. Apart from that, there is personification there. So whichever one you want to make use of, you pick and make sure you answer the question clearly. So, so you can make use of the language techniques used by the author in this quote, such as simile, metaphor, alliteration, onomatopoeia, whichever one you want to use. Now let's talk about the explain. So write about what the author used these techniques and how they enhance, okay, the book or play or the poem. We did this as well, explaining how the technique improved my response on the point. Okay. It simply means explanation. Just explain it. Okay. And the last part is the reader. We talked about the feelings of the reader, you as a reader. Okay. So reader talks about writing about the effects that this has on a modern reader and a reader from the time it was written. Okay. So be a modern reader or the time it was written and looking at the question we talked about. I mean, we both agreed on the wastefulness that comes with war or death in conflict. So we'll still talk about the same thing. So this will be the end of the class. I hope my introduction to Peter Paragraph is clear and you can make use of this to craft your own answer to how and why questions. Thank you. See you soon.